The responsibility we have is to keep our eye on the ball, which is that this is about election conspiracy and attempting to undermine how our process works. No politician is entitled to win. I know that personally. But we are all entitled to trust the process. And when that process is threatened by outside actors who are willing to undermine election security and undermine and commit fraudulent acts to achieve their ends, then they are thwarting the will of the people.
All right, guys, so I got to give credit where credit is due, right? I think that Republicans, generally speaking, are pretty bad on television, right? When they go on the mainstream liberal media, they do a bad job of playing offense instead of always defending themselves, because they know that every single time they go on these networks, these liberal media outlets, these liberal media anchors, they're not going to actually talk about the substantive issues that the American people are concerned about. They're going to try to push a narrative to smear Republicans and to talk about Trump, right? They don't bring Republicans on their networks to talk about Republican legislation or how bad the Democrats are doing or the current state of the country under Democrats. No, they bring Republicans on to have them talk about Trump and things that, quite honestly, don't matter to everyday Americans today. Like, for example, January 6th in the 2020 election. And I want to be clear here. What I mean by they don't matter in regards to what's going on today is that the reason the mainstream liberal media is telling you to care about it, or that you should care about this issue, or that we should talk about this issue, does not matter, okay? We should not talk about the 2020 election because, oh man, well, election denialism is such a big problem in this country and it's a threat to democracy. Considering how Democrats have engaged in election denialism for the past 20 or 30 years, right? They basically denied every election that they've lost, okay? They have tried to challenge the election in court and in Congress, okay? So clearly, the media's narrative in regards to the 2020 election doesn't really matter in what they want people to talk about, but it does matter in the sense that we have Joe Biden in office, okay? A idiot, a fool that is running this country off a cliff. And when they talk about January 6th, the narrative about, oh, Trump supporters being so dangerous and how they're a threat to this country, that don't really matter. Nobody cares about what happened on January 6th. Again, if you're not really going to talk about the political violence that have happened in this country from BLM and Antifa and the Roe v. Wade rioters and Trump and the political indictments against him in regards to the mainstream liberal media wants to talk about that, don't matter unless you're talking about the fact that he is being politically persecuted, that there are two standards of justice in this country that are being applied to the January 6th protesters and Trump, to people who the establishment disagrees with politically, right? That's the narrative that matters, but that's not the narrative they want to push, right? The narrative that they want to push when it comes to these issues are narratives that nobody cares about, that are irrelevant, right? And that is what this guy, George Stephanopoulos, is trying to do in this interview, right? He wants to talk about the 2020 election in a way that, in my opinion, is not really a conversation that we really need to be talking about. However, what Steve Scalise does is that he actually does talk about 2020 in a way that I think that maybe, just maybe, we should have some discussions about, right? And George Stephanopoulos is not going to like that. He's going to get extremely triggered because Steve Scalise is not going to go along with George Stephanopoulos asking the question of whether or not the 2020 election was stolen. And Steve Scalise is simply going to give him an answer that he does not want to hear, and he's going to get so triggered by it. And again, I think this is a masterclass in regards to how Republicans should handle the liberal media when they want to talk about the 2020 election. So let's go ahead and get into it.
Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was stolen?
Well, what I've told you is there are states that didn't follow their laws. That is what the state constitution, the U.S. Constitution requires. I've seen in my own state where we had to send our elections commissioner to jail years ago for fraud and corruption, and we cleaned up our act in our state. Every state ought to follow the laws that are on their books. That's what the U.S. Constitution says.
That's not what I asked. I say, can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
Look, Joe Biden's president. I know you and others want to talk about 2020. We're focused on the future. We've talked about 2020 a lot. We're talking about how to get our country back on track, how to get our economy moving, how to stand up to the bad actors around the world. Xi is not slowing down in China. He's looking at Taiwan. You see what's going on in Russia. You see what Iran is doing to work with Hamas and other terrorist organizations. This administration needs to pick up the pace. They're not standing up to the bad actors around the world. They need to. We're passing bills to address this through the House. The Senate needs to take action. The president needs to take action as well. That's what we're focused on in the House.
Yeah. So again, this is why I say that this is a masterclass. And the reason why is because Steve Scalise is maintaining his composure here over what is going to be this guy asking the same question, even though he's got the answer to his question. Okay. Steve Scalise feels like there are some states that didn't follow their laws correctly, and states should follow their own constitutions, right? I mean, he's answered the question. George Stephanopoulos continues to ask the same question, and then Steve Scalise goes into talking about all the issues that are going on in the world that we should be talking about, the fact that Republicans are trying to address these issues, but yet, again, you have the mainstream liberal media, instead of talking about those issues, right, all the things going on in the world, internationally and domestically, he wants to relitigate and talk about the 2020 election, right? Which, again, really makes him look silly. Because it's like, again, we're in 2023. The 2020 election doesn't really have much to do with what is currently going on right now and whether or not you believe that election was 100% free and fair. Okay? These liberal media anchors, they're not asking the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, okay, all the Democrats who, when Trump was in office, believed that Trump was an illegitimate president. He's not sitting here trying to relitigate that and talk about, well, do you believe that the 2016 election was fair? Right? Do you believe it was fair? He's not asking that question. In fact, when Trump was in office, he never asked. He never pressed Democrats on the importance of acknowledging that the 2016 election wasn't stolen. Never did that, right? But he wants to do that with Republicans about the 2020 election. But he's not going to press Democrats on it. All the issues in the world, this is what you want to talk about.
I know that Joe Biden is president. I'm asking you a different question. Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
What I've told you, and you've seen this, there are states that didn't follow the laws that are on their books, which is what the U.S. Constitution says they have to do.
So you just refuse to say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
So you want to keep rehashing 2020. We're talking
I just want an answer to the question, yes or no.
Threats to this country. We've asked, look, we've talked about this before, but again, will you acknowledge that there were states that didn't follow the actual state legislative enacted laws on their books, which the U.S. Constitution says they're supposed to do?
I know that every court that looked at whether the election was stolen said it wasn't, rejected those claims. And I asked you a very, very simple question. Now I've asked it, I think, the fifth time that you can't appear to answer. Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
I told you there were a handful of states that didn't follow their laws. The rest did. The rest followed. And again, states that Trump won, states that Biden won that did follow their laws. There were a handful of states that didn't follow the laws that were on the books. They went to secretaries of state to change the rules of the game, and then the voters didn't know what the rules were because ultimately the state laws weren't followed in those states. That's not what the U.S. Constitution says. At some point, we should go back to following the Constitution, George.
The courts have all followed the Constitution. They all rejected the claims you just made. And I just want to say again, for the record.
Or they said there was no standing.
You cannot say that the 2020 election was not stolen. Yes or no, was the 2020 election stolen?
What I've told you is Joe Biden's the president of the United States, and right now he's failing the country on so many fronts that matter to families. We're talking about what matters to families today. You could keep talking about 2020. I'm talking about what's wrong with our country today, how to fix the problems, how to secure America's border. You don't want to talk about that because Democrat mayors across the country are talking about how broken our border is to the point where people on the terrorist watch list from some of these hostile countries are coming into our country today, not just bringing drugs that are killing young people, but people that actually want to do us harm. And this president won't take action. We've passed legislation to fix this problem, to secure our border. The president doesn't want to negotiate with us or with Democrat mayors who are telling him it's a major problem to big cities like New York that we should all be concerned about. So the president can keep talking about the past. You can. We're going to talk about the future and how to help these families who are struggling across America with high gas prices, high prices when they go to the grocery store, every other problem that they're concerned about. That's what we're focused on in this House.
Thanks for your time.
Again, this is exactly what Republicans should do, right? How hard was that? Okay, literally reject the premise, right, of the question, right, in the sense that he doesn't actually ever take debate and answer the question, because for him, answering the question directly, he doesn't gain anything, right? He doesn't gain anything from it, okay? He also doesn't lose anything because he's already telling you what he thinks. Hey, I think that some states had some issues, but Joe Biden is president, and I'm focused on what's happening today. And what's happening today under Joe Biden is this issue, that issue, this issue, that issue that we should talk about instead of rehashing the 2020 election and whether or not I feel it was 100% free and fair, right? This should be, honestly, the standard Republican answer, because what he said there, right, reveals, again, the priorities of the mainstream liberal media and how they want to sit around and talk to Republicans about things that don't matter, right? When the things that actually do matter, like the real kitchen table issues, inflation, the border, crime, they don't want to talk about that, right? We don't want to talk about that because, again, those things make Democrats look bad. And notice how when Steve Scalise did answer the question about the 2020 election, and he brought up the fact that, in his opinion, some states didn't follow the laws on their books. Notice how George Stephanopoulos, he didn't want to get into that, right? Steve Scalise asked him directly, well, do you think that all the states followed their laws and that what they did was, all constitutional? Again, George Stephanopoulos didn't want to answer that question. Why don't you want to talk about that, okay? If you want to talk about 2020 election, okay, fine. Let's talk about some of the issues. But apparently, that's not what he really wants to talk about. What he wants to do here is to get Steve Scalise to give him a yes or no answer, a gotcha. Right? A gotcha. And Steve Scalise just wasn't going for it. And then you never saw the mainstream liberal media obsess over whether or not Democrats acknowledged that the 2016 election was 100% free and fair, right? While Democrats were saying that it wasn't, even though clearly it was, right? What you actually saw them do is actually play into the conspiracy from Democrats that the 2016 election was stolen by pushing the Russia hoax, right? Again, it blows my mind that they're still talking about the 2020 election when we have all these pressing issues in this country, right? The Republican Party should not relegate themselves to being bought on to mainstream liberal media to talk about the 2020 election or Trump, right? Anytime those subjects come up, Republicans need to do exactly what Steve Scalise did, okay? And don't give in to what they're trying to get you to say, right? And talk about the actual kitchen table issues, right? Talk about the real issues and question the media. Why don't you want to talk about that? Why don't you want to talk about everything else going on in the world besides what happened in 2020? But if you're going to talk about it, right, if you're going to talk about some of these issues, like, for example, the Trump trials, right, talk about how it was a political witch hunt, right? It's a political witch hunt. Reject the premise, okay? If you want to talk about January 6th, say, hey, I believe that we have some political prisoners here. There are two standards of justice going on here. That's what Vivek Ramaswamy does every single time, right? He doesn't give into the premise that the mainstream liberal media is trying to present, right? He rejects the premise outright, okay? Just like Steve Scalise did here, in the sense that, look, why are we even talking about this in the first place, right? And if you want to talk about it, okay, we can talk about some of the issues that went on in certain states. But again, that's not what the liberal media wants to talk about. Just like they don't want to talk about the real issues that actually matter today in regards to the kitchen table, right? Inflation, the border, crime. They don't want to talk about that stuff, okay? So again, you gotta expose the media and show people that why are we talking about the 2020 election, okay? Instead of talking about the real core issues that matter to the American people today. And I think that Steve Scalise did a good job on that. I really do. I think that he put on a masterclass, and they should be rolling this film in Congress, showing other Republicans that's how you handle the media when they ask about the 2020 election. They want to have a conversation about it, and it does not benefit you politically, right? You talk about why are we having this conversation in the first place, and you go back to talk about the real issues, right, that actually matter to people. So, hey, let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.